Cosmic here, welcome back to the channel, and today we have part 2 of our 3-part series of celebrating Star Wars Unlimited and the other games that I want to really celebrate in 2024 that were coming out. You can go check my 2024 overview video if you're not sure what I'm talking about, but today we have the first meta report for the largest event so far with over 200 players battling out in the UK. Now, I do want to add just my own kind of quick thoughts up front here, because again, this is only going to be a 3-part series, but I've been playing this locally and been having a lot of fun with Star Wars Unlimited, and I will say, you know, the game is still as fun and as engaging as I expected it to be. It is one that very much rewards you for putting in the time and effort to learn the matchups, because there are certain scenarios where if you make even a single misdeployment or take a wrong action in a round, it can cost you the entire game, or if you use the wrong removal at the wrong time. So it is really like any other good trading card game. If you want to play at the top competitive level, you need to put in the time, but this one can come across as even more punishing because of the way that the actions take place back and forth. Now, that said, a lot of times you will find other lines that can help you achieve a victory in that game overall, but just something to keep in mind. And then the other part I kind of want to talk about up front is that, at least from a IP perspective, like, look, I grew up with these Star Wars movies, but I am very quickly learning that I do not love the IP as much as some of my locals do. And that's a me problem, not anybody else, but it does make it a little rough when you're just trying to play games and people want to just talk like really in-depth about Star Wars. But hey, at the end of the day, it is a IP-based game, so you are going to expect some of that. But again, it is very much a me problem and something that is well celebrated within the community, I'm sure. That said, the games are still super fun. I really do like the leader design. The aspects are not playing out as much as I might have liked them. We are going to see that in some of these lists, which I'll talk about a little bit more detail when we see them. But otherwise, I think this is one that just really needs more time to spend with a deeper card pool. We're going to see really some of these more aspect penalties maybe come up and some of the other cool things that players can be doing. But with that said, here is a quick look at the top 16. And I do have to add here that all of the top 8 was Boba Fett. And maybe not surprising for at least a little bit that I've been playing it. It is a popular character. It is an absurdly good deck right now with, I don't believe, a single bad matchup in the format, or at least from like my initial impressions of it. So it's not all that surprising that we do see an all 8 of Boba making the cut. That said, there was no, top 16 cut. It was just straight Swiss play like we've been seeing in some other trading card games doing right now, just for the sake of limiting things to one-day events. It is what it is. But there were a couple of these lists that we're going to talk about that actually started 6-0 and then unfortunately lost the last 2 rounds, right? So you really want to know, like, what was the story behind that? Did they just have some close games and that's why they fell to 6-2? But looking beyond the top 8, I think there is something to be said about all the lists that went 6-2. And if you're new to this channel, we'll only be covering the top placing deck list of each archetype. So if you want to see more of the Boba Fett list, or if you want to just check out some of the other lists, I will have a link to Limitless in the comments below, which will give you every single deck list from the event in case you want a little bit more inspiration to dig into. So with that out of the way, let's just get into some of these lists. And off the bat, I do gotta give a special shout out here to Mr. Cool, who was the champion of the event. And also, if you've been following this channel for a while with Final Fantasy trading card game, right, they are a very, very good player in that scene as well. So kind of no surprise that we do see players who are good in one trading card game go to another and also do very well. So again, up first, as we mentioned, 8-0 making up all of the top 8 as well, or at least top 8 in standings, we do have Boba Fett. And the question that you got to ask yourself before you even consider the rest of this list is, do you love spending money? Because you need to spend some money to play this deck. And part of that is, yes, the wave 1, and I guess we're technically now in wave 2 at the time of recording this, like more supplies are getting to, or more stock is getting to stores. So we do see more things like Vader and Boba Fett kind of get into the community and try to gauge some of those prices. But generally, at least at the time that I was looking this up, Boba Fett's are about $60 a piece and Vader's are approaching $90 a piece. Whew, this is very expensive from a trading card game standpoint. The good thing to be said beyond that is, if you are to look at the price of the format kind of beyond this and with some of the other lists that we're going to talk about, the rares are largely cheap. Again, I think the rares topped out at about $10 from what I saw, at least where I got the last couple that I needed for my deck that I'm currently playing, or one of my 2 decks that I'm playing, the Sabine aggro, which is going to become Leia aggro. More on that later, you'll see why. But there is something to be said about, like, hey, if you are trying to play more on a budget, please do not let this list or this archetype scare you off. There are other options that are out there, like $50, good decks too. It's not just like, oh, you're playing a budget deck and you're just going to lose, right? No, these are actually other good, affordable, and accessible options for players, but you might need to lean more on the aggressive strategies, which are going to be a bit cheaper, where something like the Boba Fett list is just going to be the premier mid-range / control, depending on what the interior ratios look like for the deck, because of Boba Fett just being insanely strong, and then Vader being at the top end of just, well, being the best 7-drop in the game for what you can be doing. So that was a lot of talk about it, but what does this actually aim to do, right? With the black, yellow, and green, and just for the simplicity, I'm not going to say like, cunning and villainy and all that stuff. I'm just going to keep it high level for the colors, because again, a lot of the reasons why I'm doing these videos is more of like a future thing, so people can like easily understand everything that's going on, right? So yellow is going to be more of your tempo-focused colors, where it's going to be a lot of bouncing, a lot of freezing stuff. We've seen this time and time again with the yellow attribute in other card games, where it's just more of like your stun and disruption color. You then have green, which is going to be a lot of times your ramp, or in this game it has healing and a lot of really good removal. That's the one thing I will say, compared to some of the other games that we're covering on the channel right now, is just green does a lot for no reason, where it would have been a little bit more interesting to see it locked in kind of one or two things instead of just being able to do, well, just everything, at least in the first set. And then black, or villainy, and I think it's heroic, if I remember, or heroicism, and the other side, the black and white of it, is really just good and evil. So that's kind of more of a, they both have different play styles that they can lean into, but it really is more about the aspects, or again, that yellow and green that I talked about, that kind of shape up the deck and what you want to be doing. So with that said, just highlighting a couple of the cards here, we talked about green, right, in terms of it being a ramping opportunity. You have the Technician, which is going to on-die ramp. It's a 2/1. You can play it early. Getting to ramp your resources so you can go into your Vader is really important. And then you have Resupply, which is just like rampant growth, sprout. Pick your staple ramp card, sorcery, instant, whatever that we've seen time and time again, or I should say sorcery or event, right? That we've seen in a lot of card games in the past. So that is making up your ramp category. Of course, with all this ramp, we want to have something that has a big payoff, and Darth Vader is going to be that guy for this first set, and truthfully, well into the next set. I would certainly hope this card is not power creeped anytime soon, but basically it gets to come in, kill something, and deploy multiple threats to your field at a time. So something to consider is that, in case you missed the how to play video, or maybe you're seeing this sometime later, is that the way the game works is I take an action and then you take an action. So I get to play a unit, and then I would have to pass, and all these units come into play exhausted. So Darth Vader effectively allows you to cheat 2 additional actions, one with ambush, which means you get to immediately attack into something. So it gets you like a body plus removal, and then also play another unit, which would steal another action in that regard. Many times, going back to Legends of Runeterra or other Fantasy Flight games in the past that, I have played but maybe not covered on this channel, is that any time that you can cheat actions in a action-based game, it's going to be very strong. So no surprise here that Vader is going to be doing exactly that. Other than that, going into some of like the Boba Fett, which just has on attack, it can deal damage to something before they deal combat. So think about it like First Strike in Magic, or I get to deal my damage to your unit before you really get to respond to it. So in that regard, Boba Fett is just a menace of a early game play that can control the board. And for some reason, I know the reason, it's because of open fire. For some reason, it has 5 health, which is an absurd amount of health early on. So that kind of gives you the overall idea, right? We have our ramp, we have some of our board control pieces. Bossk is another great example of just having that ambush. We have the Star Viper, which is restore, so you get to heal your base as well. And we get to just stabilize until we can play some of those bigger costs. And I know Fett's Fire Spray gets a lot of love because it's also just a very good card in the list, but that gets a little bit more into how it really wants to play out. And beyond that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into these sideboard picks other than the one I'm going to comment on later, because this is more of like, this will change kind of as the meta goes on. But, generally speaking, is the meta going to be more aggro, mid-range, or control? And then you can pick your sideboard options from there. But overall, I do expect this to be one. It's very, very good. I want to be very clear that in terms of like tier 1 decks, this is definitely, cream of the crop. Beyond that, it's also just Boba Bloody Fett, right? And you have Vader in the deck. It is just going to be a fan favorite that even if this deck was a little less good, I would expect it to still be played quite heavily because there are just so many, again, fan favorite characters that kind of lead into this. And again, it's just a blast to play too, all things considered, because again, with yellow or cunning, you have all of those like fun tempo based advantage things, which, as we mentioned, if you get to do something like bounce something back to hand or give your unit first strike or shrink its power so you get a free removal, right? These are all ways you can help control the tempo of the game and the board control overall, because you have to spend an entire action point just to deploy something again. Other than that, I know that Mr. Cool has done at least 3 interviews now on this deck list, so go on YouTube. I'm sure you'll find more of the videos out there if you're curious to learn a little bit more about this playstyle. And up next, we have Grand Inquisitor, which is a favorite one of mine because it just reminds me of one of my favorite decks from Legends of Runeterra that have this like self-damaging and powering up ability, which is exactly what Grand Inquisitor wants to be doing. Now, as I just spent some time talking about how insanely good cheating actions is, or getting to cheat ahead in the play sequencing, Grand Inquisitor does just that as well. Now, it does come with the restriction on the leader side that it has to have 3 or less power that you're going to be readying, and you want to deal 2 damage to it. But when you have things like the Scout Bike, which is a 1/4, and then Grit, which means for each damage on it, it gets powered up, you can now play this, ping it, and then immediately swing for damage as well in that turn, which can sometimes be used as a board control option, can be just used for a aggressive strategy to say, hey, I am just going to attack your base and you have to waste resources removing this guy after I've already attacked with it. And then if you steal initiative, you get to then attack with it once more before your opponent can remove it. So again, stealing actions is just, or action economy is kind of the namesake really of this game in terms of how these decks are going to be balancing out. And other than that, this is really just the, hey, we have a bunch of Grit guys, and they will get stronger because Grit is just a flat damage boost. So that is something that your opponent has to consider as well. So you're able to buff up your guys, kind of round after round. Now, you are dealing 2 damage to it. So eventually you have to, you can only do it once or they might die sort of thing. But that is something to keep in mind, at least from a board control perspective. And then just other things like the Fifth Brother that gets you a little bit more of that ping damage reach, as well as powering itself up with its own ability, that where it doesn't have Grit, where it's just a flat ability, now the Fifth Brother has the raid mechanic, but it's raid 1 per damage, so you're able to buff it up even more, and then suddenly you're going to be able to swing for like 5 damage out of nowhere that your opponent might not have expected. And 5 damage that early on is very, very strong. And again, if you steal initiative, then that is immediately another 5 damage that your opponent's going to take on their base. And if they're using a 25 health base, shocker, that is a lot of health gone in just 2 very quick attacks. So other than that, in terms of like what is our top end, we talk about all this low end aggression. We talked about how Grand Inquisitor can kind of steal some action plays. And then at the top end, you have Ruthless Raider, which I have been finding out from I'm playing Iden, which is the next deck that we're going to talk about. This card slaps and is absolutely one of my favorite cards in the game right now because it's able to do 2 damage to a base, 2 damage to a unit. And it's just a 4/6 in space that your opponent is going to struggle to deal with a lot of times. This card is great. Now, I did mention this is more budget friendly, and for the large portion of this deck, it is going to be dirt cheap to build on TCGP. But the one thing I do have to note here is that Force Lightning is a 2 of here, which honestly, I could see that getting removed, all things considered. But that is a legendary, and I picked up my last copies for $10 each. So again, without going into every single price point of this, and compared to the Boba Fett deck, which I think was like $300 to $400, this one is probably 50 or less. And 50 might be a high guess, right? If we're talking base rarity, no foils, no hyperscape or anything like that, right? Just base, what is the dirt cheap I can get for this deck? Honestly, it might even be $30. Like, it is very, very cheap and accessible to get into. And it's also in my opinion, a great deck to kind of learn the format, because it has both the action cheat economy that is kind of like a very large part of the game itself, but then also with aggro, you really get to learn like, okay, do I take the initiative? Do I save playing a unit just so I can guarantee this damage on the next turn? Oh, if I guarantee this damage, do I play, something else that lets me ready a unit again and then get to attack that my opponent might not be expecting, right? So it really forces you to be on your toes about every action point decision mattering, because you have to get in that damage before your opponent can stabilize. And especially if you're using Grand Inquisitor's ability, your units can be weak. And if they play something like Bombing Run, can get rid of your entire field very, very quickly. So if you are someone who likes more aggressive strategies, absolutely check out this list. It is a lot of fun to play. And again, I really like the whole grit mechanic, so keep that in mind. Now, the Iden, now this is what I love, and I'm sorry, I gotta make my short break into Magic here, is I love Grixis, which is red, blue, black, for like every card game ever since the dawn of time. And I am playing also Iden, and in my opinion, it has a really good matchup into Boba, at least with the version that I was playing. And when I saw this list, I was like, oh my god, what is going on? Because it is so different than how I was playing my list. And the other thing about this one too, right, just from a overall cost perspective, yes, Super Laser Blast is your Wrath of God or board clear style effects. That one is going to be a little bit more expensive because it is a legendary. I am personally not running it, and I don't think it's needed, honestly. So this is another deck that if you just cut out this one card and build everything else, it is probably like $30. Now, again, there is the Avenger in the sideboard, which that one I think is a bit more necessary, which then brings it up to like 45 or 50. Depending on kind of, if you want to do the one or the two. I'm personally just having one in my sideboard because I think Emperor Palpatine is like the absolute bread and butter. So what does this deck want to be doing, right? This is another mid-range and control variant, like the one we just talked to is a more aggressive all-in strategy, and this one is much more removal heavy or more event heavy, I should say, than where I built mine. I built a much more mid-range focus. We're playing Gideon, so we can give things like, experience tokens, buff up our other units. It's a 5/5 you can play. When you get to flip into Iden, you're then also healing, which is really good. But Iden is really always wanted to be paired with a 30 health base, in my opinion, because then it turns the game into I only have 25 or 30 health on my base to I now have 35 or 40 in some cases for how much healing you will be doing once Iden's effect is online. So your effective health per game is increased significantly. So this one is far more, again, control focused. If you check the Limitless link below, we'll definitely talk, or you'll see more of those other lists that were out there. But I also really love this from a more, mid-range perspective. So again, a lot of this is just controlling the board. I think Inferno 4 is no matter what going to be the staple that you're going to have because it allows you to look at the top cards of your deck, choose them to go top or bottom. This is Scry in other card games, or in Magic, I should say. A lot of filtering options like we've seen like this. Really just deck manipulation that serves itself quite well when you're trying to find the right piece of removal. Other than that, we have a lot of Sentinel, which just helps, it's like Taunt in Hearthstone to make that comparison, because I don't think I mentioned this yet, but it basically says that your opponent must attack into it. And then one thing that's really cool is the Viper Probe Droid, which I really love because I just love seeing the information. It's also a 3 attack that you can play on 2, or for 2 energy, which is really, really important because it can trade very well into some of the other cards that your opponent's going to be playing. And then also there is a blue card, which I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, but it's basically Meddling Mage from Magic, where you name a card and your opponent can't play said card while it remains on the field. So naturally, it's a 2-card combo in 3 ofs in a 50-card deck, so don't get me started on that side, but it is technically a 2-card combo you can run in this deck. That Viper Probe Droid lets you see their hand, and you go, ooh, that is a bad card I don't want to deal with. You then follow it up immediately with the other 2-drop, or I think it's a 3-drop actually in blue, that says you can't play the card I name, and you can lock your opponent out that way and make some of the decision points a little bit awkward. And when you're playing more of the control strategy where you just need to make sure you buy yourself an extra turn or two, that can be really good. So I do really like that as well. And then another one, just like I gotta give a shout out here to the Imperial Inceptor, and just for a good space card that probably reads fine, I think, for most players, but you don't really realize how good it is until you start playing with it. But it just deals 3 damage to a space unit, and it's also a 3/2. Card is absurdly good for a common. So other than that, just a bunch of removal, a bunch of exhaust stuff. And this is where we really get, this is the list I want to talk about, right? So quick side note here overall about the cost of cards, right? So in the top left corner, you have a number. That is the cost you pay, and then you see the 2 aspects beneath it. For each aspect you do not have, you have to pay 2 more. So No Good to Me Dead in this specific deck actually cost 4. And then all the way down here at the bottom, I saw this Spark of the Rebellion, which is just a Thoughtseize style effect. It is a 6-cost Thoughtseize, and I'm just like, or again, Thoughtseize being MTG card, apologies, but you look at your opponent's hand, make them discard a card. That is probably fine for the control decks that are going to go late anyways, but it's like, man, am I really paying 6 for this card? I would have to test with it personally. That seems extremely expensive for what you want to be doing, But as I mentioned, is one of the really cool things about the aspect, penalty, and deck building in this game that is not exactly where I kind of hoped it would be like in practice, but it's still really cool from a design perspective. Now, yes, there is that Casino Han deck going around that just ignores aspects completely and is effectively the collected company version from Magic the Gathering, where you just high roll into a 7-drop and you don't care about aspects because you're playing it off of U-Wing Reinforcement. I had a couple of people play it at locals. I think it's like a really cool combo deck, but I think that is going like too far past the breaking point where it's more of a, you know, offensive note to the design philosophy of the game, where as much as I love it as a combo player, I think they screwed up on U-Wing Reinforcements, and that's probably going to come back to haunt us at some point. So later topic, later conversation, but still really cool to see either way. Last note I want to make on this one is the Emperor Palpatine. This is something that I rate. I was only playing 2 originally, something I rate a little bit lower, but this is a card that should have been a legendary. Like, I'm glad it's not because of, well, cost, I guess. It's like $2, I think, last I looked, but just from a board impact standpoint and kind of how this deck wants to progress, as well as like a board control and a 6/6 with Overwhelm, which is basically trample. Whew, this guy ends the game. Like, I really thought that Avenger was going to be the end-all be-all for, like, hey, this is my big boss monster that comes down, ends the game. No, it's Emperor Palpatine. This guy is insane, and again, has that Force Lightning effect attached to a body. So again, leaning more into the how do we cheat actions in this game. Emperor Palpatine is a huge body your opponent has to deal with, as well as removal on a stick. And a lot of times with how you're playing this deck and how you can line up damage, it will kill 3 or 4 things at a time, which is kind of crazy for how it works out, right? And then, of course, with Iden, if you're defeating a bunch of stuff and healing a bunch turn after turn after turn, that 30 health base starts to look really, really good. Going on from there, we have the other Palpatine. And yes, this does lend itself very, very well to the Boba Fett list that I talked about early on. I really won't just repeat a bunch of the stuff that I just said about the Boba Fett deck, but it is your ramp and board control. Oh, it has Boba Fett and Vader. Really cool. You know, we've seen this time and time again. There is a lot of decks that were using this trio of colors. But the cool thing I at least want to acknowledge here is that Emperor Palpatine from a leader effect allows you to steal something as long as it's damage of a non-leader unit, which can have a huge swing on a game, especially if they have something like the Vader or some of the ships or something, right? They have a little bit of damage on them. So I love this one. The leader side is maybe not as impactful as I might like, but just the steal something threat that your opponent has to kind of play around and respect all game long is super neat. Like, I really loved the design of this card and the overall theme of it. Unfortunately, I think it really does boil itself down to, unless we get into a strictly control only style of meta where you want to have a card like this deck is always just going to be a step behind the Boba Fett deck, unfortunately, but it is a lot of fun to play, and you do have some other cards that you can kind of flex in with that thought in mind. And the other thing I'm going to mention here, because I didn't mention it up top with green, Overwhelming Barrage is just an absurd card for like green removal in general. Whew, that card is insane. Again, thankfully it's cheap because it's like the best removal that we have available to us right now. But something that you definitely want to look into if you're trying to build these green decks with, hey, I want some amount of ramp, I want some amount of, like, you know, healing with the everyone using Star Viper really is what it feels like just to survive against the aggro decks. But something like this can come out if you don't really have that much of a aggro heavy format in favor for some other cards. So again, not too much to say about this one overall that we didn't already say with Boba Fett, because it is largely the same deck or plays out the exact same how we would expect it to. Just shout out to the 3 Devastator that were in this list, really trying to lend itself for a more mid-range and control format when you're getting up to 10. But again, you really have to rely on your resupply and your technicians to ramp you and get you there. And then this is the one that I really wanted to shout out, because this is the other side of it that the, green, white, and red list that I've been playing. I had Sabine, but Leia takes the cake. I thought Sabine was going to be the end-all be-all, but like pairing those 2 decks up against one another and Leia just being able to completely destroy card economy. Like, for my Battle Spirits friends, this is as white aggro as this game is ever going to get. It is just, sorry, I get to do 2 attacks before you can even respond sort of thing, and you're probably just dead when this flips. So this is very much the aggro check of the format, and you'll notice that there aren't any legendaries in this list, but the K2SO I think was like $15 the last time I looked, because this card is insane and should have been a legendary. Woo! This dude slaps that you just get to. Oh, by the way, it's a 4/4, which is statted very well early on. It has Overwhelm, so it's going to trample and deal some additional damage while removing something, and then, oops, I'm sorry, you destroyed it. Take 3 more damage to the face. Holy cow, is this card pushed? But honestly, the game needed it for how well that these other control and mid-range style decks are coming together. So again, this is someone, if you're looking for a more budget-friendly, aggressive strategy that you can get into, and this did start 6-0. Again, I really want to stress that this had a very, very strong start to it, so this is one that I would expect to pop up yet again in the near future, whenever the next major event is. Again, at 200-plus players, that is a very good turnout, and you have to respect all the players who went 6-2 and better as, you know, good starting point for lists, or at least ones that I would recommend. But I would have loved to see this list actually just win that last round, get a little bit more diversity into the, you know, top 8 spots, but as it were, you know, top 16, at least we get to see a little bit more there. So with this one, it is really all about just getting stuff online early, being super aggressive, having your 3/3s, having units that give raid to your other stuff. So again, when it attacks, it gets +1, and if you have a red 3 plus the experience counters that you're getting it, right, you can get even more boost that way. So, you know, something that starts as a 3/3, or even like your green squadron A-wing, which is a 1/3 with raid 2, then you have a raid 3, which means this is really raid 3, and then it's attacking for 4 damage. You have some ways to either cheat some additional attacks or get rebel assault, which allows you to attack for more, right? This is very much the, oops, I just am immediately adding on a bunch of damage to the board, and you will die on turn 3. When I play this deck week 1, there were many a games where I killed my opponent on turn 3 because the damage that this can just output is absolutely insane. And then at least with the Sabine version, it comes out very early, has a lot of defense, and deals additional damage with the burn effect, where Leia instead comes out a turn slower, but is able to get multiple attacks in with its effect to get you, you know, we go from Sabine that has the damage plus burn on top to Leia saying, nope, here's 2 attacks. This has raid. It also gets boosted by red 3. Like, it's just a lot of damage out of nowhere, where if they take the initiative, you are probably dead in the turn that this wants to do what it wants to do. So that's again where, if you want to learn the game and if you want to understand the take initiative versus the action economy plan, I would very strongly recommend starting with aggro, because it will force you to learn that part of the game, and you will win or lose based on those decisions. So it can be a little disruptive to start there at first, but again, I think for someone who wants to come into this game and wants a very cheap and affordable spot, definitely pick this or the Grand Inquisitor deck, because they will force you to learn the game, and they are quite good. All things considered, I would still recommend them as something to play. And then last but not least, we have the Darth Vader, or as my obligatory say, just jun them out, right? It is your traditional control plus removal into big body threats at the top end with Vader, with Emperor Palpatine. So as we kind of just talked about with the Boba Fett deck, as well as the Iden deck, if you take parts of both of them and mash them together, that is what Darth Vader is. Now, this one, I will say, has a lot more early game to respect the, you know, aggro matchup, as well as Vader's leader side ability that says if you've played a villain or villainy card, again, forgive me for which one it is off the top of my head, you get to tap it to deal 1 damage to a unit and deal 1 damage to a base. So you also want to lend yourself into this lower curve so you can always do Vader's ability, and that damage will add up over time, not only for the units, but on your opponent's base. So again, it's not too uncommon to get like 5 or 6 extra damage in, depending on how long the game is going to go with Vader's ability, and then you also get to hit them with the on attack. You may deal 2 damage to a unit. So when you combine this with things like Force Lightning or Force Choke or Open Fire, just a lot of the damage-based effects, or even Ruthless Raider, which again, this, like, I love this card. If there's one thing you take away from this video, play aggro because it's cheap. 2, I love Ruthless Raider. This card is just absolute gas. But you know, all those damage pings really start to add up, and this game doesn't have a lot of, you know, toughness or armor effects like from Legends of Runeterra, or a lot of green pump effects to where you can really get out of that damage range, because a lot of the attachments really aren't worth playing right now, because you don't want to just 2-for-1 yourself in the way that the card economy goes. So maybe this is an area where we will see a little bit more development in set 2, where the attachments kind of get a little bit more value or do a little bit more than what they are currently doing today. So with that, again, huge shout out to all players who went out to the UK launch event. Over 200 players is an absurdly good turnout for a new card game. And I really want to stress that again, anytime that you're like in the 150 to 250 range for a new card game, normally if it doesn't have an IP attached to it, but I will say Star Wars, because they've had so many games and because of the rocky start that Fantasy Flight Games has had, I think this is a very good start and a very good sign of things to come for the game, because their people are excited. The market is looking good, minus a few legendaries, and overall it just is a very good game. Again, that's why we're doing this kind of 3-part video series that highlights games that I'm really excited about in 2024 that I think are worth checking out and you should be playing. So after this, there will only be the Versus video, which I'm going to record at my local game store. Not sure when that's going to get out, but it'll hopefully be out soon. And then down the road, once some of these other game launches are out of the way, we might revisit Star Wars Unlimited if enough people ask for it, and if I am currently still playing it, but we will see what our locals looks like going forward. So with that, let me know what leader you're enjoying in Star Wars Unlimited currently below, and if you think Boba will remain as the top dog of the format throughout the rest of the Set 1 format. But until then, my friends, stay safe, stay hydrated, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.